McLean, welcome to this committee, and thank you for taking the time to be with us. I do know I gave you permission to bring someone else with you, simply because you had indicated to me that for a good portion of the time of this audit you were not in the present position that you occupy. For the record, you can come down and sit at the front next to him as well. For the sake of order, though, Mr. McLean, will you please state your name and your position, and for the record.
Good afternoon. My name is Kyle McLean. Position is Assistant Director of Tourism, with responsibility for finance and administration.
I'm wondering if your microphone is on.
Yes.
It is, okay. And would you mind stating your name and position, please?
Rosa Harris, Director of Tourism.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. Members of the committee, Mr. McLean is available for your questioning.
Mr. Chairman, through you. Mr. McLean, can you describe your role and responsibilities as the person responsible for the finances in the Department of Tourism?
Mr. Chairman, through you. As I stated, my position or my title is Assistant Director of Tourism with responsibility for finance and administration. Under that role, as it states, primarily finance, meaning the financial reporting, as well as the financial transactions and oversight of the financial function within the department, as well as, excuse me, as well as administration, which for all intents and purposes means operations. So risk and business continuity, various things such as those. I took up my role in February 2011, so I've been in that role since then.
Thank you. And in terms of since you've been in that role and since this report has come out, have you changed any of your practices in the Ministry of Tourism as a result of the report? And B, are there instances, I guess, in the past where you felt that you may have been I guess, lack of a better word, strongly guided by a politician, B, a senior officer, or C, some other person in making decisions with regard to travel policy?
Mr. Chairman, through you, since coming on board in 2011, one of the things that I've undertaken to do in my position is to enact policy, implement policy, revise policy where necessary, and to make sure that we are trying to work towards being in compliance with the various laws and the regulations that exist. As is evidenced in the 2013-14 audit of the ministry, you see that we have made great strides in achieving this. Of course, we still have a long way to go. We still have work that needs to be done. However, we have taken this report very seriously, and as well as all the Auditor General's reports. We find value in them, and we want to make sure that we can go through them, in a very detailed fashion to make sure that we are compliant. Being one of the biggest spenders in the government, we have to ensure that we are managing our expenses carefully. We are also charged with being the marketers for the country. So we have travel and hospitality as a huge line item for us. So it is very important to us that we manage this process. So as I alluded to earlier, we have quite a few different policies and procedures that are internal to the department that often I have people coming to me saying, Kyle, geez, can you please let up? We just need to have an event. Well, no, because at the end of the day, we have to answer to we have a higher calling. So we have to make sure. To get to your other question in regards to, yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Oh,
If you're finished.
okay. Just to get to your other question in regards to any, for lack of a better phrase, political interference or anything coming down from the top. Um, all I would say is that basically we are civil servants. We are here to serve the government of the day, and we are often charged with a lot of different tasks. It is our duties to say to the political officials as well as our civil service counterparts in the chief officer role or chief financial officer roles, um, where we feel that it may be a deviation from policy or where we feel that it may not be correct to do something. Now, of course, depending on what happens, the powers that be ultimately make the decisions. However, we do at all times try to voice our concerns, make sure that we are compliant as a department because we know that we are under heavy scrutiny. So we want to make sure that we are doing what we need to do.
I hear you, Mr. McLean, and thanks for that response. I guess, you know, part of this process as a member of the PAC is we want to ensure that proper policies and procedures are in place, and if there are ever any instances where there was some sort of direction or intimidation where you felt compelled to do something because of, you know, loss of job or loss of that's what I'm trying to get towards in that. If I mean, and I'm not saying that you have, I'm just asking a general question. And but if there was ever an incident, this is the time now we can kind of focus on it and try to make some recommendations saying, you know, we know examples of, and we need to correct that going forward so we protect that CFO, that CEO, that you know, that person that's in charge of the finances from any sort of interference. But I guess I just say all that to say this: have you ever been in a position where you've had to pay a travel claim without any of the proper supporting docs? And if you have, what was the procedure after that? I mean, in terms of reporting or recording that.
Okay. In my capacity, excuse me, in my capacity in the Department of Tourism, there are times when a person may have been traveling. They may have done back-to-back travel, for example, and for some reason or another, maybe a hotel receipt went missing or something along those lines. So it has happened from time to time. The actions that we typically take, which I actually took maybe about 2.5 weeks ago, was in the instance where it was a hotel bill. I contacted the hotel myself. The person said that they weren't able to get it, and I said, I'm sure you can. I contacted them myself. I received a copy of the hotel bill on their behalf, showed it to them, made sure that it was properly signed off, and then we added that to the documentation. In the past, there have been, based on the records that I've seen, there have been instances where that documentation was not present. Typically, what will happen if the documentation cannot be found, a memo is written or it has been sent to the ministry, or in the event that it's someone below the director, it would be sent to the director, notifying the director or the chief officer of what took place, the estimated costs, so on and so forth, in order to settle the travel expense claim. Outside of that, typically, if it was anything to do with, let's just say, inter-island travel, you know, it makes it a lot easier because we have the sister islands right there that we can always pull documentation if we need to. But typically, as I stated, excuse me, as I stated, what we would do is a memo would be drafted outlining exactly what took place. If a person needed to, let's say, put forward their personal credit card statement or something like that, I would advise them to make sure that they redact anything that they don't want anyone else to see, but to ensure that we have the documentation in place.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I just came in on the end of the question in regards to um, what was being referred to or acts of the staff member about intimidation of loss of jobs. I don't know whether the questioner, Mr. Conley, asks as CFO or CEO or by them. I don't know who the intimidation, who was supposed to be doing the intimidation. And that's what is he saying by anybody? Anyone that was a superior. Whether by perception or otherwise, you're saying. Yeah. I don't know about anybody doing that, but anyway, the person that you were referring to, Mr. McLean, is you're talking about staff members, and you're talking about departmental staff members.
That is correct.
Yeah, within your realm.
Yes,
Not
sir.
outside of the department.
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Okay. And that can be because the Department of Tourism have people who travel, not just staff members here, but people, representatives, particularly in the United States and Canada, who do traveling from either state to state or across borders otherwise. Thank you.
Mr. McLean, have you fully implemented the Deputy Governor's travel policy that was rolled out in 2013?
Yes, sir, we have. We have actually added a bit to it to try to make it a bit more stringent. One of the things that we actually did prior to the release of the policy that came out in July 2013 was that we had actually implemented a travel authorization document, which basically outlined what the person needed to. Well, basically, it was a business case. It was a short business case that the person had to fill out in order for us to make sure that we were at least had some insight as to what the travel was for. Of course, it's a department, so yes, the director would be very much aware, or myself would be aware of why that person would be traveling to Miami per se, for instance. However, the documentation would have to be, would have to stand for itself later on when it's being audited to say, yes, this person went to X conference. So to answer your question, yes, we have. We are still working out the kinks. We have quite often some challenges meeting the strict thresholds for hotel accommodations. However, we still try our best to work within them, as well as other aspects of the policy as well. I have people walking around with the policy now and saying, okay, can I do this under this policy? And we advise them yes or no, or we seek further clarity from the ministry or even POCS if necessary.
Now, the Auditor General clearly acknowledges in his report that it doesn't apply to elected officials within your ministry. How do you deal with ministers and councillors?
Well, in my role, I am employed by the Department of Tourism, so I don't actually do any type of transactions for the ministry.
Gotcha.
Yes, sir.
Gotcha.
Mr. McLean,
Yes, sir.
can you give me an outline of what is expected in that travel policy from A to N?
In the just for clarity, the travel policy issued by the Deputy Governor and the Portfolio of the Civil Service.
Whoever it was, yes, issued
Okay.
it.
Forgive me if I miss out a few sections, but
Before you actually proceed, Mr. Bush, would it be more appropriate if we just asked the Deputy Governor to give this committee a copy of that policy?
Well, he can, but we're asking a member, staff member, if he is adhering to it, and I want to get an understanding from him of what he's supposed to be adhering to.
I will certainly try my best, sir. The policy, very very well written and everything. What it seeks out to do is to ensure that when a civil servant goes on official travel, that they do the preliminary checks and balances prior to trying to receive a travel advance. So in doing that, one of the things that has to happen is that you have to have a travel authorization, meaning that the travel has to be authorized by a person in higher authority. So that's one of the key steps. Another key step in there is to outline the costs. Outline the costs ahead of time. And as I stated earlier, one of the key things that we had on our travel authorization document was to say whether this was budgeted or non-budgeted travel. In the event, when I say non-budgeted, it was maybe a trip that came up that we may have to accompany the ministry or something along those lines, but whether it was budgeted or unbudgeted. Beyond that, you also put forward a case as to say, okay, what is this travel for, how it will benefit, as well as when you're filling out your travel advance form, you are going to put down there the itemized costs of the travel. So you're putting down your hotel bill, you're putting down any registration fees and anything like that if you're going to a conference. In doing that as well, of course, everything has to be signed off by the powers that be, whether it's the head of department or by the chief officer in the case where the head of department is going on travel. Beyond that, what you would have there is that you also have to you have a list, or should I say, it's basically the subsistence allowance rates, a schedule of daily subsistence allowance rates, similar to what the United Nations uses. And this has set parameters, basically. So, for example, if you are going to Tampa, Florida, during this period of time, you have you have a set rate for Tampa in terms of your daily subsistence. Beyond that, there's also a premium lodging rate that is there, that is seasonal. So we are to adhere to those different rates. Where we have to deviate from those rates, we have to make a case for it, and as well as we also have to seek authorization prior to the travel. In the event that something changes, we also have to document that. Beyond that, there's also a lot of different parameters set around car rentals. There's also things in regards to expenses that are reimbursable and non-reimbursable. So there's any number of rules and policies within that policy that, depending on the situation, you would have to adhere to. So, for example, if you are taking a taxi, certain things within that policy state that yes, you can receive a reimbursement for a taxi, a cost of a taxi up to a certain amount. And then beyond that, then there's, for example, if you have to rent a car, it has to be pre-authorized. So there's any number of things just in that section. Beyond that, when you come back from your travel, then you are to fill out your travel expense claim form and produce the relevant hotel or any other types of receipts that you may have had, and then from there you have your supervisor or the person in charge sign off on that documentation, and then it's put through for payment. Now, granted, there's some steps in between there that would have to go through the vetting process to make sure that, okay, yes, you stayed at this hotel. This was the hotel you received your allowance for. Okay, you stayed at that hotel. Did something happen? Okay, no. Did you incur some extra expenditure? If there was extra expenditure that was not put on your travel advance, then either a memo would be written, special permission received, something along those lines, to ensure that there's proper documentation, as opposed to just saying, well, you received $1,200, you spent $15, okay, we'll take your word for it. No, we have to have the documentation that all adds up. If there's anything that is outside of the norm or outside of the policy, we then have to seek further guidance or further approval in order to have that authorized. I don't know if I captured everything, but I hope I gave you a good synopsis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One or two more questions. How does this relate to the various officials within the Department of Tourism oversees our agents, I call them, or travel agents, whatever we use, what terminology you use, our staff, they're our staff overseas. As I said, mooted earlier, those that particularly travel up and down to various shores in Florida, over the United States, in Canada, and of course in the UK. How all this is kept track of, and how whether all this does pertain to them. I know in the UK, quite a bit of work is done in the UK itself, and then to shows, various shows and events in Europe from the Department of Tourism there.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, through you, the Department of Tourism does operate overseas offices, as the leader of the opposition has said, in Canada, the UK, and in the USA. All of our offices have received the official travel policy. What we are in the process of doing at this moment is submitting a document to the chief officer for consideration to be further sent on to the Honorable Deputy Governor for consideration, where within those countries there may be some deviation from that policy. So, for example, in the UK, some of the rates that are in the policy may not be feasible because they may be either too low, or there may be some issue where we feel that it may not be conducive to the type of work that we need to that we are doing. In the meantime, our marching orders to our staff members are let's stick to this policy as much as we can. Where there's deviations, please let us know. We will then give you the relevant authorization if necessary. But we typically do not have that situation very often. One of the key things that we have is in line with the US would be the reimbursable and non-reimbursable expenses. As the committee may be aware, there are a lot of guidelines around reimbursable and non-reimbursable expenses under US tax law. So there are things in there that we are now trying to make sure that we are following the policy, but ensuring that we're also fair to our US, UK, and Canadian staff to ensure that we are also in compliance with their laws and their procedures and everything. Hope that answers your question, sir.
So before one of our travel agents or staff goes to a travel event, they have to go through this whole rigmarole, all this bureaucracy. By the time they finish all that, they forgot where they're going from. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. McLean? Mr. McLean, thank you very much for appearing before the committee and giving your testimony today. You are excused. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, sir.
At this time, I would like to go ahead and summons our next witness. I'm making one change to allow Mr. Strandbaden, who is the chief officer in the Ministry of District Administration, Tourism and Transport. I had asked him, he does have a time constraint in that he has a deadline, not deadline, but he has other obligations that he must meet later this afternoon. So I said we'd try and fit him in and take his testimony at this time. Thank you, Mr. Baden. Welcome to the committee. Thanks for your patience. For the record, would you state your name and position, and then we shall allow members of the committee to question you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Strandbaden, Chief Officer in the Ministry of District Administration, Tourism and Transport.
Thank you, sir. Members of the committee, your witness. Mr. Connolly.
Mr. Chairman, through you to the Chief Officer. Mr. Barton, in this audit report for the period of some three and a half years, it was noted that the ministry had not managed travel and hospitality expenditures in accordance, or in the opinion of the Auditor General, in accordance with the expectations of the PMFL. What would you say on behalf of your ministry as to why this was the case, and also what has changed, if anything, since the report has been published?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. First of all, I would like to state that I joined the ministry in February of 2012, so that was on the tail end of the audit period. With the Deputy Governor's response at the back, I think speaks to it nicely. There could have been more efficiencies, more record keeping, or greater record keeping done previously. What has changed since this report and my coming to the ministry, obviously across the government has adopted the official travel policy. That was led by the Deputy Governor, but we had, all chief officers had input. So it took a while. It was adopted in July 2013, but it was in the works for a while. I can't remember exactly the length of time, but we wanted a robust policy that not just only addressed the Ministry of Tourism, but transport, travel across the entire government. And that took a while to get that input. But with that now in place and being adhered to, I mean, when I travel as chief officer, when the President Deputy Premier travels, the entire staff is aware of the policy. The policy is with personal assistance to chief financial officers. They know if there's travel to Miami, New York, wherever, that there's a price for, or a cost for per diem, hotels, etc. And there has to be a business case put in place why the travel is being done. And that is in keeping with the policy and with all audit procedures as well.
And I understand. I mean, I know that the ministry has changed. I mean, before it was finance, tourism, and development. So it's, you know, there are lots of other moving parts.
Right.
But since the travel procedure, as travel policy has come into place, can you say how how you get assurances from your CFO that everything is being managed in accordance with that and the PMFL? i.e., how do you monitor it, and how do you get satisfied that, you know, things have now been put in a sufficiently robust manner that you can sleep better at night?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, great question. I mean, the finance staff in the Ministry of Finance unit are all certified CPAs at the chief and deputy chief level. So when they, first of all, what happens, I guess I'll start there. A request comes in from say, Department of Tourism to have travel. I don't look at that first. It goes to the Ministry of Finance team, who verifies it against the official travel policy and the budget. This then comes to me, and I've been assured that it fits within the budget and fits within the official travel policy. And this is coming from certified individuals that don't want to risk any of their many designations to authorize the expenditure of funds. So I'm quite assured by each travel opportunity. What it also does, by going through the process that's now in place, the budget has to be the budget has to be there, so it's the planning for it has to take place. The director of tourism, who travels quite a bit, has to be thinking well in advance that if they're going to a show, a conference, a workshop, that they need to have the proper documents in place, or it will not happen. And that has happened, where I said, you know, this needs to be done prior, and if it's not done, it doesn't happen.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the witness?
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead, sir.
No,
the question was posed in regards to tourism, but can I just ask the chief officer that his answer in regards to tourism would be probably the same in regards to Douala, or what was Douala when he got it? District administration, let's call that part of it now. It would be the same answer, right?
Mr. Chairman, through you, yes, sir.
Except you took over that part since 2013. Yes, you took over one part since 2012, tourism, and district administration in 2013.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
And the answer would be the same.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. The answer would be the same across the ministry. So just to give an example, my travel to Cayman, although domestic flight, I will have to state why I'm going to the BRAC, what meetings I'm going to have in the BRAC. Thank you.
Mr. Bodden, just for the record then, have you fully implemented the travel policy, the policy that was rolled out by the Auditor General?
For the record, yes, sir, it has been fully implemented. As the Department of Tourism was mentioning before, they are in the process of providing some input to myself on how the policy for the book of business of tourism is traveling, Mr. Chairman. So that going worldwide to spread the word about Cayman, to drive visitation to Cayman, takes traveling. And it needs to be in sync with that. It's a document that we see as dynamic across the pool of chief officers. We recognize that it will have to be changed to reflect the times, but it is a policy document that is adhered to. The other day in chief officers meeting, we recognized that some of the hotel accommodation rates for some regions may need to be adjusted as the world comes back from a global recession and so forth, that rates are starting to creep up, and we're not going to be able to be held accountable to those rates specifically as they were at the time. So it's a document that is dynamic and needs to be reviewed periodically.
Okay, thank you, sir.
would you say that you agree with all or most of the recommendations from this report? And if so, just also, can you say when your ministry will be in full compliance with the PMFL, in your opinion?
Mr. Chairman, thank the member for the question. Right now, as of the 13-14 audit, we received a qualified opinion from the Office of the Auditor General. That was the first time that either Ministry of Tourism or District Administration had received a qualified opinion, something we're very proud of. We still have quite a bit of work to do, but the culture change is there, that it is going to happen. We have a plan in place. I think we have something like 6 qualifications we need to work on. We hope to clear up approximately half of those in 14-15, so 3 out of 6, and then 15-16 we work on the remaining 3. A lot of those points are issues of fixed assets and so forth, whereas in Cayman Brac, Little Cayman, we have our own public works department, and the tracking and recording of those assets needs some work to bring it up to the international public sector accounting standards. But we see that as taking some time, but we do have a plan in place, and we are on track, and we work closely with the Office of the Auditor General to show that we have put in place plans, we put in place a culture change to take the finances of the ministry from what they were to a qualified and eventually unqualified opinion.
Thank you.
Questions from other members? If not, then, Mr. Bodnam, thank you for your testimony before the committee. I'll excuse you at this point, and we will summon our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, members.
I'd like to summon our next witness, who is Mrs. Nadisha Walters. Good afternoon, Ms. Walters. Welcome to this committee, and thank you for coming along to give your testimony this afternoon. Apologize for the length of time it's taken us to get here, but we are determined that we're going to get through this report today. For the record, please, ma'am, would you please state your name and your title in... I need for you to put the mic, and speak into the microphone. There's a switch right there you can turn it on with. Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
My name is Nadisha Walters. I'm currently the Chief Financial Officer for the portfolio of the Civil Service, also responsible for Cabinet Office.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, this witness is available for your questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. Ms. Walters, during the period of time that this report was written, did you have a good understanding of your responsibility as the CFO under the PMFL, including ensuring that there are sufficient policies and procedures to ensure compliance?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Hugh.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that in mind, can you perhaps give us some ideas to why travel claims are routinely processed in your ministry without proper support to determine what expenditures were for, and whether the expenditures incurred were for government business or indeed good value for money?
Well, at the time in our ministry, all travel advances were not processed centrally at the ministry. A lot of times the travel advances were processed at the departmental level. So for example, HODs would approve the travel advances for their underlying staff. The ones that came up to the ministry was mainly the HODs needing approval by the chief officer, and of course, travel within the ministry administration itself, including the minister.
Thank you for that answer. What was the process then when these travel reports finally reached your desk where documentation was missing or according to the report, sometimes even evidence that travel took place or that the funding was spent on what it was claimed for?
Okay. I guess there's two stages to the travel, the approval of the advance and then the subsequent claim. In terms of the advance, the way our ministry was structured at the time, the advances went through the chief officer for approval. So when it got to my desk or my staff, the finance staff, it was already approved by the chief officer. We were not involved at the level when it came to, I guess, justification of the travel and having that business case. It was more the processing of the payment so that the employee could travel. Most times, in terms of the advances, a lot of times there was a flat rate that was approved. So it wasn't, there was a certain period of time where it wasn't expected that you have to come back with receipts. We had a changeover of chief officers, I believe, during that time, and the new chief officer, I think, changed up it a bit when he came on board. But initially, those flat per diems, it wasn't expected that you had to claim them back. They were just a flat rate that was supposed to cover like your meals and other incidentals while you were away. In cases now where, I guess, for a minister, a lot of time travel was charged to the credit cards, travel expenditure. So we did have an issue there sometimes with processing credit card claims and needing to have the supporting documentation when you're processing the claim. We weren't able to receive the receipts from her. You know, it was requested, but, you know, that never happened for us. The only thing is we were kind of caught as well because we had the obligation, the charge has already been made on the credit card. So you have that, government have that liability to RBC to pay that credit card. So initially when we were trying to enforce the credit card claims in the process and ensure we have support before paying it, we had now the other leg where we were getting called by, I think, the then chief officer of Ministry of Finance that we had to pay the credit card claims in time and not be incurring. We had the other issue now with late fees and interest charges incurring, trying to process the claim, you know, properly.
So, sorry, so just to clarify then, so in what you just described, there were actually you were facing two issues there. One where you actually couldn't verify that it was a legitimate charge on the card and not a fraudulent charge. And two, whether the charges on the card could be verified as official, business, or personal.
Correct. I think in terms of ensuring, what we done at the minimum was anytime this credit card statement came with the various charges, whether it be travel related or not, it was always given to the credit card holder to review and determine that the charges, you know, like they signed off to say, well, yes, these are legit charges, you know, they incurred these charges. So we did have that obligation to pay it. As I said, you know, in the case with the minister, we didn't always get the detailed support in terms of the receipt for all the individual transactions, but we were obligated still to pay the credit card payment.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. And so, one, does this still happen? And two, you know, it concerns me because I mentioned it earlier, but I'll use an example. One of my favorite restaurants is an Italian restaurant, but when I charge it on my credit card or my debit card, it says ITIL Cayman. It doesn't actually say the name of the restaurant. And in many instances, so you wouldn't be able to tell whether ITIL Cayman is a restaurant or whether it's a massage spa or whatever. And there are several businesses out there, nightclubs and others, that actually deliberately use names that don't define what the entity does as a business. So it concerns me in both ways that you can't actually confirm what it was used for and also whether or not it's still happening.
Yes, I agree. In certain instances, there might be where you can't tell easily from the name what it was for, but in most instances, you can see whether it was hotel charges or like restaurants and the like. So it wasn't, I don't recall a lot of situations where you just couldn't tell from the name what it was that was being charged. And in a lot of instances, most of the charges, as I said, was travel related, so it would be coded to official travel, and we didn't necessarily like distinguish to say, well, this portion was food or whatnot. It was mostly official travel or hotel accommodations that it would have been booked to.
Mr. Chairman, through you, I mean, just listening to you, Ms. Walters, I'm wondering if you ever felt any pressure on you not to follow procedures set out in the PMFL by superiors, or where you felt you had to act without proper documentation, like you've suggested, because the bank was owed the money. Did you ever feel that type of pressure in that role?
There is some sort of pressure there where, you know, in most instances, you do need to have, or you should have, support and documentation for all transactions being incurred. How we handle it in that case, we've made numerous requests. You know, we advise to say it is normal procedure to get support and documentation. What I also had to do was notify the chief officer to say, this is what is happening. We're not receiving support from, you know, the minister regarding proper receipts when it comes to the charges. So, you know, we notified who we thought was best to notify in terms of our direct report, and that's our chief officer.
Who was the chief officer at the time?
Well, at the time, we actually had two chief officers during that period. Well, it was Mr. Gomez originally, and then Mr. Alan Jones took over the helm.
Okay. And in any of those instances, did you ever refuse payment for the minister or someone else in the situation where the only justification was to pay the bank because they were owed rather than having any of the documentation? Or and this is an and, not an or, did you ever withhold payment for salary for, or suggest withholding payment for salary from that minister or superior?
No, we didn't take it to that.
Because, I mean, in other, we had another witness earlier who, you know, stated that that was what his ministry did in terms of when they would basically take the payment straight from salary. So that seems to me like one of the ways to counteract some of this stuff and to curb that type of behavior, you know, the instances of that happening.
I agree. You know, we did talk about it in terms of taking salary, but at the time it wasn't discussed to say at the minister. In terms of compliance, the other staff, for the most part, complied, you know, in terms of providing support and documentation. So it wasn't the norm that we didn't have support and documentations for most other claims. It was just, you know, at the higher level, sometimes you just didn't get that support.
When we say from support, that from the chief officer?
As I said, we brought it to the chief officer's attention. I was advised that, you know, he would liaise with minister on it. I never got back an official response to say, and we still had the payments to make. You know, I had followed up, but there wasn't any consensus in terms of, like, say, well, minister, you know, started producing the receipts.
When did you leave that ministry?
1st of November, 2013.
And before you left, and in light of the audit findings of the Auditor General, were there any significant actions or any actions at all taken to ensure compliance with the PMFL on your part?
Well, we reviewed the policy. Well, at the time before, a credit card policy was already issued, I believe, in 2010. And there was even an internal audit, I believe, on the whole credit card management. So I had utilized that report, the internal audit report, especially in terms of developing tighter procedures when it comes to the credit card claims, as of course, which included travel expenditure on that. But in terms of the report, the travel policy that was issued in July 2013, that was basically when I was wrapping up at that ministry. I was in the year end for 2012-13. So pretty much that was the priority in terms of completing the annual reports. So the travel policy itself, now in my new role for Portfolio of Civil Service, I've gone through it with a fine-tooth comb. I've even worked with Chief Officer in terms of developing a checklist, because it's a very detailed document. So almost like you almost need a little checklist to kind of guide you through that you're complying with all the different areas. So we have implemented that. So that has been quite helpful.
Mr. Chairman, just through you, and I guess based on your past experience and present experience and following up on the report and the Auditor General's commentary and recommendations, what would you say your new approach would be given the same circumstances presenting themselves to you as you've described back in the dollar ministry?
Well, basically, the travel policy gives you very clear guidelines and have very clear reporting hierarchies. I think, as I said, it still is lacking where right now it still doesn't apply to ministers. I'm advised that, but the ministers have adopted it. Currently, I don't have a minister over our portfolio, so all the staff in our ministry has to comply with it. And I do have the full support of the Chief Officer as well as the Deputy Governor in terms of enforcing the policy. So, it is a great help just having those clear guidelines, and that you're not just speaking out there and no one is actually listening to say, well, okay, we're not getting the support. This is, a very public topic right now, and that we need to get it right.
Ms. Walters, with regard to the Auditor General's report and the I think it looks like there's about 11 recommendations there, or multiple recommendations there. What has your ministry done with regard to these recommendations?
Let me refresh myself with some of the recommendations. Well, I think one of the earlier recommendations was to actually develop a policy and have a documented policy. The Portfolio of Civil Service is, I guess, the driver when it comes to this policy and ensuring that it's updated. So the portfolio plays an integral role. They're actually in the process of reviewing the policy, or have actually reviewed the policy, I think, to make recommendations to update it, Let me see. They have, in recommendation number 7, government should provide training to chief officers and chief financial officers on their roles and responsibilities. I don't think that when it comes to the travel and the credit card policy, they've actually had any training as yet. Maybe it was while I was on maternity leave if they did. But I know in terms of just knowing, to say, not to say how much power that you have, but in terms of in my situation where I had a minister not producing the receipts, like what are the avenues, what are your options? You know, like you reported to the chief officer. I had had a separate conversation with deputy governor where it was expected that I should come and report that non-compliance to the deputy governor. But at the time, there wasn't any clear policies and procedures. And then as a CFO, you would kind of feel like you're overstepping by going beyond your chief officer and your minister to go to the deputy governor. So if that is the expectation that we should, you know, carry it to the deputy governor, it would be good if those kind of, you know, reporting structure is highlighted in the policy. That would be one of the things I would recommend in terms of an update. I know they also talked about ensuring accuracy of the information that is being reported. Normally in our ministry, the report at times was a little difficult to follow because it was jumping between different ministries. So I don't know if they considered my previous ministry one where they couldn't get detailed information from. But I know we normally pride ourselves in putting, you know, quality information into the IRIS system. I've always stressed it with the finance staff, you know, in terms of that you have quality information to see, such that when someone reads the report, runs the report from the system, they can tell what that transaction was for without having to go to the manual records. But at the same time, the report, you know, I don't see, or I don't know if it was that I wasn't in office at the time, but no one came to say if they wanted further clarification on any of the transactions. I didn't get any queries in terms of, okay, we see this transaction here. Can you give some more insight on this transaction? I wasn't involved, or we were not presented or given that opportunity to kind of explain things further.
Is there a hospitality policy that's been implemented?
Not that I'm aware of. There's no hospitality policy.
Okay. Mr. Connolly?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Through you. In terms of the I think it's table 5, where we see table 2 on page 5, where we see that again the two ministries that were looked at, or of the ministries that were looked at, the two top ones in terms of expenditure through that period. Second, when they're at 12% of travel and hospitality expenditures, was dollar. Right? In your opinion, what needs to be implemented other than something like a hospitality policy to ensure that there is proper checks and balances where this won't happen again? I mean, I know that we have a travel policy, but there seems, and again, just piggybacking on what the chairman has said, that there's still more policies and more checks and balances and procedures that need to be in place before this committee can kind of be assured that there won't be abuses, again, for lack of a better word, in terms of government spending.
Okay. Referring back to the table, the ministry, my former ministry, took up 12% of the allocation spent on the travel and hospitality. I think what this table fails to present is just to kind of add perspective or scope to these figures. At the time, the Ministry of Dala was one of the largest ministries. We had basically 15 departments under our portfolio. And I don't think in the presentation of the figures that are reported here, it doesn't give the reader like perspective. And just referring, I had read where they had quoted something on the Christmas parties for our ministry. As I said, I'm no longer with the ministry, so I don't have access to the information to go back and analyze it. But if I just took some averages here, saying that we spent 30,000 on Christmas parties over 3 years, that's like, say, an average of $10,000 a year on Christmas parties. The ministry itself had almost like around up to 800 staff members that was under its remit at the time. So, as I said, just basically using the figures reported here, if I just take that to get an average of how much per employee was spent on those years, we're looking at maybe $12 and change, you know? And I'm not sure, as I said, to confirm these figures, just going straight by what's here. And currently, PAC has the responsibility now for the hospitality budget when it comes to Christmas parties, and the rate per head is $25. So, you know, as I said, there wasn't any opportunity given to go and just kind of add some context to the numbers being reported, because you read that and it, you know, looks ridiculous. But then if you actually kind of just take some average and how much numbers of employees there, as I said, that's like $12 a head.
But you mentioned, you know, you said the ministry contains like some 15 different departments.
Yes.
Does that include the statutory authorities as well? And the
That
government?
does not even include statutory authorities, but I don't think their figures would have been reported
Okay,
in this
that's
report.
what I was trying to get at
Yes,
as well.
we had about maybe another 4 or 5 statutory departments that we were responsible for. I think as well during that time, our finance section was also plagued with human resources restraints as well, because that election, I can't remember the year, I think we had jumped to being from like 7 departments to 15 departments with no extra resources in the finance section. So we were dealing with a greater volume, you know, a lot of times just processing day-to-day transactions. You know, you knew that you needed to develop stricter policies and procedures, but at time you didn't have the opportunity to sit down and actually, you know, develop more strategic objectives. So that's what we were dealing with at that time.
Okay. Mr. Connolly?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Through you. The report deals with, and I'm not saying that this is your ministry or otherwise, but in paragraph 45 on page 12, talks about ministers effectively self-approving payments incurred on their credit cards, you know, for significant amounts, and the general lack of control and this significant risk of abuse by senior government officials and ministers. Can you tell me specifically now what you are doing in your ministry to curb or stop this type of general practice that existed, or that the Auditor General has said it existed at the time of this audit?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, now I don't have a minister under our portfolio, but in terms, we have the credit card policy that we ensure that we strictly comply with that. So every time charges are made to the credit card, well, we would receive the credit card statement from Treasury. We also have the process where if the credit card statements aren't received in time, we have online access to go on and print the online statement so that we can ensure that we process the payment in time to avoid any additional late charges and interest charge. As well, what we do is pretty much every transaction that is listed on the credit card statement, we ensure that we have proper support for it. We also require the credit card holder to sign the credit card statement itself to say they're verifying that all these transactions are official travel, official business related. There's a set forms in place that we have to complete the credit card claim form. That's reviewed. At the departmental level, we'll have a review where their finance people will check it. It'll come to us at the portfolio level, and we will ensure that we review everything over, and we have another sign off there before it's actually sent to Treasury for processing.
No further from me. Thank you.
Any other questions for the witness? Okay. There are no further questions, and we go ahead and excuse you. Mr. Booth?
The question asked by Mr. Conley was whether the officer answered that. Maybe then I missed it in regards to the self approval.
Mr. Chairman, through you, in terms of self-approval, as I said, with the credit card statements, it is a requirement where we have the credit card holder sign the credit card, but it still have the claim that there's a separate documentation where it's reviewed by the CFO or chief officer, and there's a sign off there on the actual claim form. So you would normally see the credit card holder signing the statement itself, but you wouldn't see like the other approvers at times to say have another signature there.
At the time they said this was done, you were in that dollar ministry?
Yes.
Could it have been that they self-approved minister traveling and came upon extra expenses because perhaps a delegation, and so she approved it to get the increase to pay for the delegation?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
Well, there was a question I asked of you in regards to the self-approval of the increase on the credit card.
Oh, of the increase?
Yeah.
Okay, no.
I don't know whether you had answered that. I don't know whether Mr. Conley got an answer on that.
Well, what I understood from what you said, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that the onus was on the minister to sign the credit card receipt saying that it was for official
the statement.
The statement
Yeah.
to say it was for official travel, and that's what you would have used as the approvals of sorts. So, they're saying the $70,000. Well, I don't know.
Yeah, I
if
don't
that
know
were-
if it's
yeah.
for our ministry.
Whatever the purpose, whatever the amount was, by them signing that statement, that's basically what was required of them, and that's what you would have accepted.
Well, that's all we got, as I had noted earlier when it came to the minister. We weren't able to receive actual receipts to review the credit card
But
statement.
the requirement was that the minister signed for what the purpose was. That's what you're saying?
Yeah, we normally, anytime a credit card statement came, we've always requested that the card holder, so minister, HOD, chief officer, actually sign the credit card statement to say that they verified and all the transactions, are legitimate.
And you were satisfied with that? I mean, the auditor has said it was self-approval, which sounds, way out,
Oh,
which makes it sound, like somebody's doing something terribly wrong, but you are satisfied as the chief financial officer. The process was they signed and they identified to you.
Right, without receiving the physical receipts.
At that time.
That was, yeah,
At that
that's
time.
what we had to rely
At the
on.
time of approval you're talking about, but you wouldn't have a receipt at the time of approval. You would get that afterwards.
At the time of the credit card claim approval.
Expenditure.
Yeah, we should
Expenditure.
have, once the statement is in office, all the receipts should be in hand by then.
So you're talking about at the time of statement
Yes.
and not before.
No, because we don't know before when they're making the charges. They have the credit card, so we're only seeing the transactions after. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, just in the CFO's opinion, then, was that an adequate check and balance on spending in your view?
I don't agree that that was adequate, but that was the situation that we were dealing with.
So, sorry, Mr. Chairman, through you as well. So, in terms of, again, now, what could happen in today's world? Am I right in saying that could not happen again in this new regime, or because it might be taken then from salary and other things if they can't properly document and justify it, or is it still the case that we're deficient in that and we must then have proper records, etc., before we authorize this type of cash?
In the current regime, and now that there's so much attention on the matter, it actually bolsters our position in terms of ensuring that all receipts, all expenses are properly supported by all staff members and including ministers. So it has improved the process and made our jobs a bit easier, because with the attention and the public attention on this expenditure, even though, as we say, we did recognize that the expenditure is not a significant expenditure for the portfolio or for the government. I don't have the exact figure from my former ministry, but from the figures reported, it's less than 1% of the government's expenditure. But I do recognize that, this is a very public area, so we need to make sure that we have that transparency and accountability.
Yeah, because, again, Mr. Chairman, I think it's not the amount that is, well, for me personally, is the issue. And I get what you talk about, scale and proportionality and all the rest of that. But it is, even if it was $1, it's the public's dollar, and we as a government need to ensure and show those looking that we have proper procedures in place, that we can document, the business case, and justify the expenditure, and more so on your part, the verification and of that once those funds are expended from the government purse, which is the public purse.
I agree with you. It is very important, as you say, even to $1 accounting for it. As I said, in terms of my role, the situation with the minister, it was an exception, not the rule. It just so happens that, yes, a lot of the costs relating to our travel budget was incurred by the minister.
there are no further questions, and I would like to thank you for your testimony this afternoon, Ms. Walters. We'll release you from the committee, and thank you again for your testimony. You're excused.
Thank you.
I'd like to call our next witness into the chambers, Ms. Wendy Manzanares. Thank you, Ms. Manzanares. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee meeting. Thank you for appearing before this afternoon to give your testimony in respect to this important report. For the record, would you please state your name and your position?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Wendy Manzanares. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Ministry of Financial Services, Commerce and Environment.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee, Ms. Manzanares is available for your questioning.
Mr. Chairman, through you to Ms. Manzanares. Can you tell me what you understand your role as CFO under the PMFL is to ensure that policies and procedures are compliant with that law?
What my role is? Well, I'm responsible for the finance function for the ministry, and in fulfilling that function, I have to ensure that all departments as well as ministry administration are compliant with those laws in terms of putting policies in place to adhere to the laws.
Okay. Thank you. And in that role then, according to the report that we have in front of us, there seems to be claims that travel was routinely processed without prior support to determine what the expenditures were for and whether the expenditures incurred were A, for government business, or B, for good value. How did you at that time reconcile those, if this report is accurate, so you can either say you think it is or not, how did you reconcile that at the time, i.e. paying these things without the proper support? And were you at any time pressured into doing so, even where you found or you thought that that there wasn't enough justification for some of these payments? And I don't know if you were here for the previous witness, but some of the, when I say intimidation, not by someone saying to you, you must do this, but pressure because of things like the bank is calling and going, where are our payments, rather than someone saying to you, you must pay this regardless.
Right. Through you, Mr. Chairman, in relation to your question, as far as being pressured, I didn't feel any particular pressure in any way as far as meeting the payments. It was basically in avoidance of incurring interest charges on the government cards. It was our duty then to go to the various card holders, have them review their card statements, in instances for credit cards and have them provide a supporting documentation. In cases where supporting documentation was not provided, the cardholder would we would send them a memo basically asking them to review it and confirm whether they were official charges or personal charges, and we would get something back from the cardholder confirming that.
Mr. Chairman, was there any point in time when you didn't get the corresponding, I guess, documentation, and like the previous witness, because of the policy at the time, you just had the person responsible sign the statement saying that it was official, and that was all that was needed for you to process the payment?
Well, as far as our ministry, during this period of time, I am aware that we did send memos on a regular basis to the cardholders if they were not able to provide the supporting documents. In most cases, we did get the supporting documentation. So it was a very rare few cases that we didn't, and we provided the memo to the cardholder, and they in turn would respond or make a notation on that memo or credit card statement confirming that they were official charges.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, through you. Could you say whether or not during that period of time, as far as you were concerned, when they were traveling, was there competitive shopping done for transportation, for hotels, etc.? Or what was the policy based on that?
Before you get to that, Mr. Chairman, you get to the transport piece. I wanted to ask a question on the matter that Mr. Connery raised.
Let him finish his question, then we can come back to you.
So, but all I was trying to keep it in line, since he's moving away from the expenditure he's moving to the transport section. I think that's what you're going to ask. Oh, well, whichever one you want, Mr. Chairman. I can ask whatever I want to ask
question.
at a time.
Go ahead, Mr. Hu.
Could you repeat the question for me, please? Thanks.
Certainly. I was just asking if in your recollection during that period, was there any competitive shopping done when it came to booking hotels or transportation, or was there a policy, like we heard somebody say earlier, that today there's certain rates or policies as far as transport or hotel rooms? Or
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in relation to your question, there was no formal travel policy in place at the time covered by the report. Therefore, we actually got some correspondence from the financial secretary at the time to ensure that we would use Cayman Airways as our first point. And in some instances, if Cayman Airways was unable to book a certain route that we needed, we would go to a private travel agency. As far as hotels, I'm not aware of any competitive practice as far as seeking rates and so forth.
For informational purposes, Mr. Chairman, that the question asked by Mr. Conley was one that was asked in court and was given a very solid answer. as I said,
Observation or question, sir?
just for informational purposes.
Oh, okay.
I'm just going to go to another question. In terms of, through you, Mr. Chairman, in terms of best practice and professional standards, as the CFO at that time, and I guess I'm not asking this to you in your personal capacity as CFO for this ministry, but I'm just asking you as a CFO with a professional designation, et cetera, and also for your fellow CFOs, and just trying to kind of get in my mind, the lay of the land that at the time that this report was written. Was there ever any discussion in that and around the CFO grouping? I don't know if you guys meet regularly or, you know, under the chief officer or that aspect, but was there any dialogue, even if it was the water cooler talk, that, you know, our job is hard to do because of lack of proper procedures and reporting, and et cetera? Or was it, well, this is just how it is, and this is how we go along? And the reason why I'm asking is that because of, you know, certain professional standards, and I guess some people might have come from private sector before, or, you know, at least done it theoretically in getting their CPA designations or CAA designations. Was there any time when the CFO has stepped up and said, this isn't the way that it should be done, and made representations to the DG or the chief officer saying we need to put policies and procedures in place, or this is going to have some consequences down the road?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. I do recall initially, first to state, because you said with me being CFO of this agency and so forth, I was reporting to Ms. Josephine Sambula, who was a senior CFO at the time. So during that time, she was leading the ministry during the entire time covering the report. But during that time, I do recall hearing CFOs, they may have met occasionally, but discussing many different issues that we faced as far as IRIS, as far as policies, no uniformity in reporting. So there were various issues highlighted by the various CFOs, sometimes put in writing. There were reviews done, as you guys may be aware of, the PMFL and various processes. So it has been highlighted in many instances by the CFOs.
Sorry, and in your opinion then, you know, but for this report, did any of those comments, et cetera, relate in some tangible policies and procedures and checks and balances that helped your role going forward?
From what point on? Sorry.
From your discussions, the memos, the representations to, you know, superiors, et cetera. I'm just trying to see where we were, where we are, and also then I have a follow-up kind of question / suggestion after you answer, just to see if that would also, in your opinion, make your job as a CFO a bit easier and more kind of streamlined.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman. In response to your question, a lot of the correspondence, a lot of what was put forth by CFOs, I'm not exactly sure it was anything official. I think like they would use one person to make the communication forward. I'm not sure. we all had our complaints about systems and processes and so forth over time. And I think over time it has evolved and it has improved. And with the travel policy that was put in place, things have improved significantly, because I can attest to I'm currently the CFO for financial services, and I know in our ministry we are doing regular credit card claims, posting it. We are doing monthly reporting on credit cards and travel. So at any point in time, you could go on the website, see what a particular minister or staff member spent on travel in a particular month. You can see anything that was charged to their card in a particular month. So I think the travel policy really pushed this, the culture in a whole across government to improve.
Okay, thank you. And then my follow-up to that is, do you think the next step or the next the next evolution should be a system-wide accounting manual where everybody is just following one plan, one I guess blueprint, so to speak, so we can have consistency and kind of stated checks and balances, or do you think that that's too premature to get to that stage? Yeah.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. In response to your question, I do believe that it has been discussed many times in the past, and very recently, maybe in the past 6 months or more, there was a meeting with the acting accountant general at the time, Mr. Ronnie Dunn, where CFOs also expressed to him the lack of uniformity across government. And just the mere fact that sometimes when we're reaching out to an agency, we could reach out to maybe 3 or 4 people, and each person has a different opinion on the way something should be done. So I guess manuals across the board could be helpful as far as to attain consistency in the way things are done. And I guess it will be very helpful for audit as well. And I'm sure after the travel policy was put in place, they're probably finding a lot of things improving across the board, where people are complying with the travel policy more, or trying to fall in line and being compliant with the travel policy, for example.
Other questions for this witness?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
the question of the lack of proper procedures, the staff member would be able to see that the procedures that were used for over many, many years, and that there were processes and procedures now in place. Maybe people today would say there was none, or they weren't good enough, and they would make a case that they're not good enough, and they put something else in place and say, well, this is what is best now. But as far as the accountability according to the proper process and procedure, that existed.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, in response to the member, I do believe there were processes in place. I just think that refining of the process, a little more clarity added to the processes, because various ministries, each ministry was doing something different. Each ministry had a different per diem. Each ministry had a different subsistence rate and meals rate, and various where their sources for where they sought to for hotels as well as airlines. There was not a lot of consistency in across the board. So I think with the travel policy, I guess, being put in place since then, yes, there were procedures, but I think that it's helped with them being more compliant as far as following and ensuring more value for money as far as their choices and consistency across the board. So now there's everybody, if you're a minister, you're going to get the same rate. You're going to Miami, all the ministers are getting the same rate. And I think we had an issue previously where the rates were very different between ministries.
So is what you're speaking of is the fact that while we had processes and procedures and policies, it is that before we had those policies, procedures, practices, and each ministry or department, let's say sometimes, had a different one. I know what you're saying because some had 200 at one point. I was getting $90 per diem, and other people were getting $150, chief officers at that time, sometimes. So I know there were inconsistencies, but that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
So it's not the fact that there weren't accountability and certain processes in place. It's the fact that different ministers had their own, and everyone operated differently.
Right. No consistency between the ministries.
Anything else? Ms. Manzanares, thank you for your testimony this afternoon. We excuse you from the committee at this time.
Thank you.
I'd like to call Mr. Alan Jones, Chief Officer, to the chambers. Good afternoon, Mr. Jones. Thank you for attending the Public Accounts Committee this evening for this hearing. For the record, would you please state your name and your position?
Yeah, good afternoon, sir. Alan Jones, Chief Officer, Ministry of Planning, Lands, Agriculture, Housing and Infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Members of the committee, Mr. Jones is available for your questioning.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, can you describe for us what you believe your role is under the PMFL to ensure there are adequate financial policies, practices, and controls in place?
Yes, sir. I mean, I fully understand the role that I and the CFO play within the ministry. We need to make sure that the right checks and balances are in place, that allowances, expenditure is according to the government's laws and procedures, and to ensure that there's proper accountability and transparency at all levels. So yes, I fully understand the requirements under the law.
Through you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jones, during the period of this report, what was your role in relation to approving advances or travel based on value for money for the ministry?
Well, if I can give you a little bit of context, I think Mrs. Walters touched on this earlier on. When I took over as Chief Officer in the ministry in February 2012, I think it's fair to say I found a system that wasn't quite in line with what I was expecting. So I took steps to to change what I regarded as maybe some flawed procedures in certain areas. I think it's probably fair to say I have a reputation as being one of the more cheaper, I like to use the word frugal, chief officers. And for example, in terms of overseas travel, realizing that we needed to get on top of what was becoming and still is a very important area, I'd issued a directive to all the HODs and my ministry staff in September 2012, basically saying that all overseas travel and expenses should be standardized. And I applied at that point the figures which I had been using when I was Director of Lands and Survey, which essentially were taken from the old general orders. I dealt with, and I think the Auditor General deals with this in his report on a general level, I had dealt with the per diem in a slightly different way. The law allows for that. It allows you to deal with it two ways, either an all-inclusive figure where you pay you pay for food and incidentals or out-of-pocket expenses, or you can do it separately and pay a fixed amount for food, which you ask for receipts back, and pay a small additional amount, which I used to call a per diem, which is a per diem for the out-of-pocket expenses. So I actually did it slightly differently in Lands and Survey. That is slightly different from the way the new travel policy now deals with it, where the per diem includes food and incidentals, and receipts aren't asked for either of those expenses. So I introduced this new process with these fixed amounts. I also directed in April to all of my HODs and the ministry generally that we needed to have proper reconciliation of all travel advances. That is something that I recognised was not happening regularly enough, both at the departmental and the ministry level, and needed to change. It's quite clear that the reconciliation needs to take place within 7 days, and there was some discussion in some length this morning about, I think it was Mr. Vinton talking about the ability and the power to deduct money from salary if reconciliation doesn't take place. It says within 7 days. I think the Auditor General alluded to this. I mean, that's what we aim for, but the key point is to get it reconciled quickly so that it doesn't get forgotten. And then the third step that I took was I instructed all my departments that all overseas travel, no matter who and in what department, had to come through me and be approved by myself. This was jointly driven partly because of government's severe financial problems at that time. So there was clearly a need to curtail any expenditure which we could avoid. And secondly was the second driver was the fact that I felt that I didn't feel that there was a proper process in place to control it. And I wanted to get some consistency. Being a new chief officer as well, I wanted to ensure that I had sufficient time to ascertain what the current situation was on the ground across the whole ministry, and therefore introduce these policies quite early in my tenure to bring some consistency to this area. So, rather long-winded answer, sir, but I think it was gives you some context.
Mr. Jones, how do you ensure or get assurance from your CFO that expenditures are being managed in accordance with the PMFL? Like, what can you describe that process to this committee?
Excuse me. Any particular expenditures, so that you're talking about there, because the process would differ depending on what time.
In terms of just the how the CFO goes about doing their role, including, I guess, the processing, because we are talking about the travel and hospitality expenditures. How do they see that that there's a business case? Are they tracking the receipts, et cetera, to justify, or to verify the the payments that were, or charges that were incurred, that sort of thing.
Excuse me. Certainly at ministry level, as I alluded to before, all approvals are seen by me at the moment anyway. That will be changed shortly. I'm in the process of reviewing my delegations to my HODs because we've had time to discuss this matter and fully digest the travel policy, etc. So in terms of the business case, all business cases at the moment have to effectively come through me as chief officer. So needless to say, I'm satisfying myself, but that's the process. I think it's probably fair to say that the business case has been something that's probably been lacking. I'm talking across government generally here. I would agree with the Auditor General's comments in that regard. Particularly when you're sending people overseas for sort of training and that sort of thing, you need to be satisfied that training isn't available locally, isn't available in Florida as opposed to Singapore or wherever you're going. So in answer to your question, the chief officer is, in terms of let's deal with travel claim reconciliation, I have instructed him to ensure that within 7 days, his allocated staff member ensures that reconciliation takes place. As with all of these things, there's an element of trust involved. You give it to a professional, you have to assume at a certain level it's going to get done. I'm very fortunate. I have a great team. I have a very good CFO, very strict CFO. And I have to say that I have told him to deal with me as he deals with any other employee. If there's something missing, come back and nag me for it. But beyond that, through my personal assistant, we will go in and we will do a random check of all of the travel advances, for example, that have been issued and ensure that the reconciliation did in fact take place. From my personal experience, which is somewhat different to other ministries, because I'm somewhat new, there's a little bit of a change of culture, I think, required. I think this is brought out in the report generally. There's a change of culture within government generally. And one thing I would like to say, if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Chairman, just quickly, I have to say that I think the Auditor General's report was a very good one. I think it was extremely opportune. It was very good timing. It came in at a perfect time. And I think the proof of the pudding in some ways is the fact that government has taken on the recommendations and is doing its level best. And I believe it's doing a good job of implementing those recommendations. There's been a lot of talk about the travel policy that was introduced by the Deputy Governor in consultation with the chief officers. And this was a team effort. It wasn't just the DG saying this will happen. Everybody signed up for this, realizing that there was an issue that needed to be addressed. I think the report hits a lot of the important areas very well. Yes, there's one or two things that we can disagree on. That's normal. I think Mrs. Walters made a good point a little while ago about the importance of context in some of these things. But generally speaking, I think that the changes that were needed, and changes were needed, I believe, have been made, are being made, and I believe that the appropriate, certainly in my ministry, and I believe it to be the case in other ministries too, the appropriate checks and balances are now in place, that the system is working. I'm never going to say it's perfect, but it's working well, I believe. So. Pardon me, Mr. Conn, I know I went off at a bit of a tangent, but I thought it was worthwhile saying.
No, that's fine. And I mean, I just wonder if the Auditor General has anything to add to those observations.
Go ahead, sir.
Not really. Thank you, Mr. Jones, for those comments. I think it's important to realise that this report is not just issued cold without our colleagues in civil service and government having a chance to opportunity to comment on it and taking it on board. This report went through a three-month clearance process subsequent to the issuance of the draft, where officials were able to comment and make observations on it. And I think one of the welcome things that happened throughout the audit is that the government actually took actions while the audit was going underway It's like they were taking the action to draft the policy, take forward a policy around travel, because they recognised before we'd finished this audit that it was an issue for themselves, that they needed to put in place processes and systems to manage this more effectively and put in place the high-level policies to give them the clear guidance across the government. So I think, from my perspective, you know, they started the process as we went along to the start of the audit, from from my perspective, is great. We always want, if people can actually demonstrate to us that they're starting to take action as we're doing the work, it's a great message that is coming out of that they are taking the actions, taking it seriously and taking it forward.
Some more context. Mr. Jones, in terms of the overall action since the report, can you kind of explain what has changed in your ministry, if anything, significantly since the report, and what kind of what things still need to be done to get, you know, near to the full set of recommendations? Just, I mean, I don't need it line by line, but just in general.
Yes, sir. I mean, again, without reiterating, I would say, generally speaking, we're fairly close to ticking all of the boxes in terms of the recommendation, certainly in my area, and I believe across government. To give you some examples, you know, in terms of travel advances, they are always being reconciled now. We're getting business cases for all applications for travel overseas. The travel policy itself is ensuring that there is consistency in terms of how things are dealt with, in terms of per diem amounts, these sort of things. I've taken it a step further on the per diem. We're very careful, for example, where you give somebody a per diem of whatever it is, $100 a day, but they're going on a conference where it's effectively full board, and we reduce that per diem maybe to $25 a day because they're getting the food. So I use that as just an example, just to, things are being looked at much more tightly, as it should have always been the case. And we are, I believe, getting value for money. We've got transparency, and we've got those checks and balances in place to ensure that you know, people aren't just being given money in travel advances and they're never been reconciled. You know, that to be frank is unforgivable. It is, I think, as Mr. Chinsey mentioned, it's effectively a loan. So, so from certainly in my ministry, I feel very comfortable that we're where we need to be. There'll be a slight change in my own personal circumstances soon as the delegations change, as I say, and I put more of the responsibility back onto the HODs. But I have a very good set of HODs, so I'm comfortable that the good work will continue under their control. But obviously, ministry will continue to monitor that situation. In terms of perhaps improvements, I think it is fair to say that one of the weaknesses, speaking as a chief officer, and I'm not getting into specific personal circumstances here, I'm just talking generally, that any chief officer will always have a possible situation in relation to the political side of the ministry, the minister. We've already talked about the fact that the travel policy itself does not directly apply to ministers or councillors, for that matter. The Premier has said that it has been adopted, but it does beg the question whether or not we need some, maybe a formal policy, a similar policy for cabinet and councillors, running alongside contemporaneously with the civil service one. Just a suggestion. And I think Mr. Bodden talked about the fact that chief officers are already looking at reviewing the hotel rates that are included within the policy, because there needs to be some discretion. And it was always meant to be a work in progress, and the document itself, like any policy document, will be fine-tuned over time. There is one point I would like to bring up, though, which I think is significant. And again, I'm talking about on a general level here, because I know this has caused some issues. There was some talk, or has been some talk, about self-approval of travel claims. I'm not talking credit cards here, I'm talking travel claims by chief officers and ministers. And I would just refer you to personnel regulations, Section 11, reimbursement of costs incurred in course of duties. And if you go down to subclause 3, B, it says an official member or chief officer may approve the reimbursement for himself rather than referring it to his appointing officer. Now, to my mind, that's clear. The term is used as reimbursement, but it's dealt with in the overall context of the claim. It's dealt with as part of your expenses that we're talking about. So it would appear to me that the regulations, personnel regulations 2012, permit the chief officer and or the minister to approve their own travel claim with the proviso, and this is included in subsection A, that it meets the criteria previously itemized. For example, the maximum per diem is $200 per day, that sort of thing. Now, I'm not going to sit here and argue for or against the regulation. I'm not here to make policy. That's a government function. But as long as that clause remains in personnel regulations, this issue about self-approval will be discussed. And at the moment, there is nothing wrong with self-approval. That's not to say the amounts are right, but the procedure of self-approval is in the regulations. Now, it may well be, and I'm not saying that we should do this, but it might well be that to clear up some inconsistencies, that might want to be looked at. Having said that, the other side of the coin is the budget for PLAHI is my minister's budget and my budget. It's all government money, obviously, public money, but it's our budget, our budget allocation, our appropriation. So the question is, should the minister or should the chief officer have to go, in my case, to the deputy governor to get approval? And who would the minister go to? I just throw that out as going to Mr. Connolly's point, because this self-approval has been put over as a questionable activity, but as I say, the regulations do provide for it.
Can I just make one comment? And there's always going to be a level at which self-approval is required, but I would add that even if you're self-approving, you need to provide the documentation and the receipts for that expenditures for it to be paid. Otherwise, there's an issue about being able to pay it at that stage.
Yeah.
At what level I think chief officers, there's an argument that chief officers should be able to self-approve, or heads of agents, heads of a statutory authority, for example. There has to be some stage where it has to be the case, but they still have to be able to justify and document all their expenditure, and the CFO has to be able to challenge them if there's no documentation for that post.
I fully agree, sir. Yeah.
Then that's and there has to be an avenue if they have a real concern where they can take their issues. Like, for example, if it's a statutory authority, it would be to the board. If it's in a ministry, it would be to the deputy governor, for example. But so that I don't have an issue with that per se, but it's about the supporting documentation and justification.
Yes, sir. I mean, if I just might add, I completely agree with that. Again, the supporting documentation doesn't necessarily talk to the appropriateness of where somebody stays or whatever. So there's always going to be that little bit of a loophole. But I completely agree. The only thing I would say is there's a little bit of a contradiction in terms of how, for example, on official travel, I have to make a business case to the deputy governor to get approval to go on official leave. So if I'm going on a course, I have to put up that, even though I can self-approve the expenses involved in that per the regs, I still have to get the deputy governor's approval to the business case. So.
Mr. Jones, just my final question is, in terms of any sort of interference or intimidation or pressure, have you felt that now or previously in your role when it comes to dealing with the political arm of government? And if so, how would you deal with that now? I.e., are there proper systems and procedures in place to make you feel comfortable taking whatever action you feel is the correct action, given the policies and procedures in place?
I'll deal with the last bit first, if I may, and come back to the first. Going back to my point about the travel policy, I think until such time as there's a travel policy put in place for the political side, we're always going to have issues. So long as we have the situation where effectively the political arm is signing on to the civil service policy sort of voluntarily, I think there's always going to be an area there of difficulty. I think Mrs. Walters talked to this very well when she was up here a short while ago. You know, yeah, in our ministry there were some difficulties, but I think that's typical. I'm not here to attack any particular individual or make comment about any individual, but I think it's just the nature of the beast between the divide between the civil service side and the political side, and that issue has been there and will always be there. You know, there is this relationship that needs to be worked on. I'm extremely fortunate that at the present time I have a minister who is whiter than white when it comes to all of these sort of things, and hardly ever travels anyway. Except came back occasionally. But it is difficult, and you know the question is always put. Well, you know, shouldn't the chief officer say to a minister, for example, you know, do you really want to be staying in this hotel? Isn't it rather expensive? You know, and maybe the minister might say, well, really, that's not for you to tell me, is it? Because there's nothing in regulations, there is no policy, whatever. It's my budget. You know, I'm just paraphrasing here. So in answer to your question, Mr. Connolly, yes, there's been issues. I haven't been in the ministry that long. I know there were issues that I inherited, so I know they were there. But again, the question ultimately needs to be asked, you know, what is the role of the chief officer in this particular case in relation to the minister in terms of questioning if you've got this self-approval in here? You might have the receipts, and certainly I would challenge, and I have challenged in relation to getting receipts. I don't have a problem with that now, but I mean, I know other people have had problems with it. But it doesn't get to the point about the quantum. It just gets down to the receipt for the audit trail. So.
Yeah, no, the reason why I ask is that, you know, this committee is tasked with making recommendations as well, you know, post this forum. And, you know, one of those recommendations could be that the political arm puts a system in place of checks and balances for its own actions. And that's what I was trying to get to in that, you know, to me, it would clear up a lot of ambiguities if we, meaning we as the political arm, kind of didn't leave it so discretionary and so up in the air, so to speak, that if we policed ourselves, then a lot of these things would go away, and at each stage, people would feel more empowered to question because there would be something to fall back on. It was what I was trying to
no, absolutely, sir. I think I alluded to that earlier on. If you have a document that you can refer to, then there's no ambiguity with it, really. There may always be a little bit of discretion, but there shouldn't really be much ambiguity, and that's what I think is missing a little bit.
Mr. Jones, we learned earlier from at least one other witness that up to this point, because there is still no hospitality policy. We've got to travel, but no hospitality. How do you deal with requests for hospitality payments and stuff at this point in time?
To be frank, one of the first things I would say about that is how you define hospitality. It's like, how do you define official entertainment, is all of these things. This has been discussed, and I believe that the Deputy Governor will be working on this. We do need another document, whether it's incorporated within the existing travel and hospitality policy, an expanded version, but we do need to deal with that. I think the issues are the same ones that existed in relation to travel policy. It's the inconsistency and it's the definition. We've touched on this issue earlier on about alcohol, for example. You know, if you're taking out, you know, consultants who are coming from overseas, you know, it's probably appropriate to say, well, would you like a glass of wine? You know, is that hospitality? Is that official entertainment? Different people, different views. I would agree, though, in short, that it does need to be worked on. I don't believe that there's a major problem, certainly in my area, with that. It can be closely monitored through the budget process anyway, in terms of monitoring departmental budgets. At the ministry level, obviously, it's somewhat different, but was there anything, sir, that specifically you wished me to address in terms of...
I know you say it's not a big problem in your ministry. Maybe it's because maybe the ministry isn't doing a lot of entertainment or stuff. But I mean, what sort of policies do you follow? I mean, is it, you know, if the minister goes out and he has dinner with some visiting dignitaries and he buys a bottle of wine, does it get refused? In terms of pay?
No, sir. I would have to say, going back to some extent to the travel policy issue and the self-approval, in terms of official entertainment, at the moment, as it relates to a minister, one would take it at face value that the minister was undertaking official entertainment or appropriate official entertainment or hospitality. That's not to say, of course, that I or any other chief officer, for example, wouldn't question it if it was viewed as some extraordinary event, but generally day to day, it's probably fair to say that it would be left to the discretion of the minister to, if you, in that particular case, that you were, you know, it would apply to me too. You know, I mean, if I take out visiting consultants or visiting permanent secretaries or whoever. But we do need I would agree we need a policy.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, the policy, through you, the policy or the practice, let's say, if there is no policy, I mean, whether there is a perceived policy or whether there's a written one.
So, excuse me, sir, it was written one I was talking about. I think there are directives out there, I think, and understandings.
Yeah, well, and there are practices.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know of any minister that had any entertainment allowances, for instance. Other than you put together your budget, there are the various headings of your budget which come down here. It gets dragged through the mud or praised or whatever. It gets passed.
Mm-hmm.
And for the various sections, if you're dealing in planning and you have to go after a planning meeting somewhere about overseas, and you have to do some entertainment, obviously that's covered within that budget.
There is a in every budget, be it ministry or departmental, there is several what I would call line items, but they're effectively accounts within it. One of which is official entertainment. So the budget process does allow you to put in money as part of your appropriation for official entertainment. But of course, the budget process allows that allocation to be exceeded so long as the expenditure within the expenditure grouping is not exceeded. So,
but I've never had any entertainment allowance that I know about. I've never gotten an entertainment allowance, nor car allowance, or any such allowance. I've never had any. You could be right that there are line items that might refer, and I don't know if they have any funds in that line item.
The official entertainment line item, as we're calling it, is a departmental. It's an entity-based. It's not personal. I believe there are one or two posts within government that do have certain allowances like that attached to them. I don't know which they are. I think there's one or two, but very much the exception. But they are They are based on the entity. So the ministry would have an official entertainment budget of $5,000, which could be used by anybody that got approval from the chief officer to use it for the same.
But I've never seen it. I've never had one.
Well, as I say, so it wouldn't be normally personal, it would be within
Abroad.
the budget. Within the budget for the department or the ministry, yeah.
Any other questions for the witness? Not, Mr. Jones, I thank you for coming to the committee this evening and giving us your testimony. You are excused from the chambers. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, it's 10 after 3. We've been sitting here now for a good 2 hours. Let's take a 5-minute break. Stretch your legs. 5 minutes only.